In the time since we last spoke, much has happened. It's day 7 or 8, and the protests are still going on, still riots, still looting, still protesters being killed, still police being killed. There are casualties on both sides, and neither side's bad element is excusable, let's make that clear. A black teenager was shot in the head with a rubber bullet and taken to the hospital with a skull fracture. Meanwhile, a retired black police chief was shot dead in the street with a real bullet. These one-for-one interactions continue all up and down the country. For every video of police shoving nonviolent protesters to the ground and hitting them with batons, there's a video of rocks and bottles being thrown and hitting officers in the face. None of this is good. And there's a lot more to talk about as stuff is developed. I don't hardly know where to begin. This episode is a mess from an organization standpoint and will devolve as time goes on. One thing this situation has brought forth is a whole lot of sympathy from brands. The brands are out in full force to make sure you know how much Black Lives matter to them, as well as how many of their products are conveniently going on sale, as well as how much they'd really prefer you not loot their stores. You'd be hard-pressed to find a brand that hasn't spoken up about this situation. Even Pokemon made a Twitter post saying Brock Lives Matter. Ben & Jerry's made a particularly strong statement about things, but they've established themselves as a heavily political brand in the past with ice cream flavors like Pecan Resist and Empower Mint. Word is they're coming out with a new brand of George Floyd ice cream. It's like cookies and cream, but instead of cookies and cream, it's fentanyl and meth. Okay, I will concede that it is probably too early in the episode for a joke like that, especially when I am attempting to regain more of a neutral stance on this issue. But one thing that hasn't changed amid all this chaos is that I am still Sunburned Albino, and Sunburned Albino's kind of an asshole. Also, Floyd's autopsy did reveal levels of methamphetamines and fentanyl in his system. It was officially updated recently, so call me a dick, but I'm not a liar. Also, I'm not even saying that's why he died. It's just a circumstance. He had just gotten over coronavirus, too, and we know part of the symptoms of that shit is that it destroys your lung capacity, which I would say relevantly affects your ability to breathe, but let me still make it clear that the dude kept saying he couldn't breathe and was ignored for 10 minutes, so it's still not his fault. I will now tug at the collar of my shirt and move on. The support from brands and people in general has been so overwhelming that many of the main organizations receiving donations have had to be like, okay, stop it, we have too much money. Bailing out looters and calling Ubers for Antifa members was less expensive than we thought. Please direct your funds elsewhere. I do still think if you're going to donate, to pick something that doesn't have anything to do with bail. Otherwise, you're literally funding the destruction of the communities you're trying to protect. The George Floyd Memorial Fund has raised over $13 million. That is going to be one lavish-ass funeral. All of that money goes right into the control of George's brother, and it says right on the page that 100% of the funds go to his family to be used at his and their discretion. Among the listed uses for said funds are funeral and burial expenses, mental and grief counseling, lodging and travel for court proceedings, and to assist our family in the days to come as we continue to seek justice for George. I mean, not to sound nosy, but if you threw him Princess Diana's funeral, hired Johnny Depp's therapist for a year, and traveled to all your court dates in a private jet, you'd all still have several $1 million just laying around. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I was on this GoFundMe page looking at stuff, and people were still donating in real time, frequently. I mean, their goal was $1.5 million. They're almost 10 times over that. And this GoFundMe has a link in it to another GoFundMe set up by George's sister, and that GoFundMe has raised $370,000 when the goal was set to $5,000, and the description for what that GoFundMe's money is going to be used for is traveling and other expenses. I don't know what your guys' plans were when you set these up, but you're going to Fiji now. The Bahamas are within reach. When this is all over, treat yourselves to an extended vacation. Hell, you could live there. I'm not saying they're going to abuse the funds. It's just a fuck ton of money to give one family. And if anyone here is like, $13 million gained is nothing compared to the staggering loss of a dear family member. It's not nothing. Lots of families don't get $13 million when a member dies. In fact, I would be so bold as to say most of them don't. It helps. I'd rather grieve in a mansion than an apartment. And before you jump down my throat, if you haven't already, my beef is not with this family, it's with crowdfunding in general. There's no ceiling. And in this case, you don't know whether your money's going to a funeral or a new ashtray. But back to brands. Jesus, this video is going to be way longer than I thought. Are people really comforted by companies all saying the same shit about systemic racial injustice and the fact that they all have black employees they love and cherish like their own daughters? I see people making lists of companies that have and haven't spoken out, and I'm just like, why are you looking to Burger King for your moral wisdom? When did Totino's become responsible for feeding your stomach and your soul? I've seen people people see a brand copy-paste the same press release that got faxed over to them from every other company in the country and be like, wow, good job, Subway. I'm gonna start eating at your establishments more now. What the hell for? It's not like Subway is replacing all their BLTs with BLMs. The menu is the same, the food is the same, but people act like going to a restaurant has to be like going to church now. The people I eat with all have to have the same values as me. You go into a restaurant that hasn't made a statement, take a bite out of your sandwich, like, this tastes suspiciously racist. You know what it is? I think people nowadays are making their spiritual and mental health everyone else's responsibility. Like, that's not just something you can find within, but it has to be reinforced by everything and everyone you interact with. And you treat any non-affirmers in your life like they're undermining your personal security. So when Lego decides it's going to discontinue all its police and fireman-themed Lego sets, you cheer because, hooray! Lego is also anti-cop, just like you. Except it isn't, because that shit'll be back into production inside of a month. Also, what did the firemen ever do? I've never heard of fire brutality. Of course, it helps when you're not up against human beings, just flames and kittens. The YouTubers and streamers have not escaped this brand scrutiny. Every popular person who hasn't said anything yet is feeling the pressure to say something, and people who usually don't talk about politics are bravely taking the stand they feel would be most agreeable to their audience. It's very brave. Black Lives Matter. Oh, chef's kiss, so brave. Don't they know that by sharing this truly divisive opinion, they might run the risk of getting extreme internet clout and multiplying their follower count? 89% of surveyed people think Officer Kneecap is either getting the right sentence or not good enough. 89% of America is on board with him facing charges. Even the vast majority of the people who see Black Lives Matter as a political statement, what's meaning has been warped beyond the initial word definitions, still believe that Black lives do matter from a purely dictionary standpoint, because of course they do. But then people are like, well, they don't seem to matter to the cops. But I'd say that's less because of racism in a country where over 100,000 police officers are black, and more because the police is almost its own race, and is fiercely protective of those who serve and protect, even when they're not really serving or protecting. Like, if you want to say cops have a systemic problem, you go right ahead, because oftentimes they are more committed to saving their own asses than dishing out justice. But while you maybe say this is a result of pernicious, offensive racism, I think it's more because of tenacious, defensive brotherhood. If the precinct wants to protect someone who fucked up, they'll do it regardless of the race of the victim involved. You think they don't plant guns on white drug addicts or shoot unarmed white criminals in the back? They do it more than with black people. Sure, because there are more white people around, but when you adjust for population and see a disparity in black criminals getting in those kinds of situations, you have to remember that the percentage of black criminals versus the black population is higher than the percentage of white criminals versus the white population in the first place. I picked up some new stats, and look, it's easy to look at any stat that shows black people having a higher percentage of whatever and go, well, yeah, because racism. 38% of white males will be arrested at least once by the time they reach age 23, whereas with black males, it's 49%. Well, yeah, because racism. In 2019, 24% of all police killings were black Americans, despite blacks only being 13% of the population. Well, yeah, because racism. This next stat is framed negatively in the site I found it on when it should be celebrated. It says 99% of all officers involved in all police killings in 2019 had no criminal charges pressed against them. Good. That means they were nearly 99% justified. If you're in a standoff with a violent criminal with a gun and he aims it at you and you shoot him, you should not be charged for that shit. And the vast majority of police killings fall under that violent crime umbrella. So yes, there should be a very high clear rate for officers overall. Nobody would come to work if the chief was like, all right, today you're clearing out a drug den. We suspect at least 15 people on site. Most will be armed and dangerous, and they will shoot to kill. But if any of them die, you're going to jail for 20 years. And I've heard the talking point of black people commit more crimes coming under fire a lot recently, and it's interesting the way that's evolved. Because at first, if you brought it up, people would just be like, well, that's not true, and it's racist that you would even suggest it. But now the people who didn't believe it have accepted it because they can blame white people. Now they're like, well, of course black people commit more crimes. White people enslaved them and oppressed them and kept them under their thumb for centuries. That's just further proof of the systemic racism that pervades the core of our civilization. But, what about black majority cities? All the highest black populated cities also happen to have the highest crime rates in the country, despite a distinct lack of white people oppressing them. Cities where the black population is like 70 to 80%. When you've got cities full of mostly black people committing crimes against other mostly black people, being arrested by mostly black people who answer to a local government of mostly black people, where do the white people sneak into the crowd and oppress everyone from the shadows? And please, 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 do not mistake any of what I'm saying as a condemnation against black people as a whole. I do not have a single negative thing to say about black people collectively. I have been called a racist by people who used to be friends of mine, and that shit hurts because it's blatantly untrue, and I know for a goddamn fact I listen to more black voices talk about these kinds of issues than they do. Easy. I've got receipts from both sides of the aisle. I've watched interviews with Larry Elder, Thomas Sowell, Chloe Valdery, Daryl Dixon, Candace Owens. I've seen debates with Michael Eric Dyson and Shalice Seacrest, and I've been called a racist by people who wouldn't recognize a single one of those names. Nobody wants an ally with an empty head. Learn a fact or two. Contend. Also, go fuck yourself. You know who you are. Hell, half my opinions on this subject have come from listening to black people say the same type of shit. I know there are black people who agree with me in many respects, and I know there are black people who have some concerns. Race is a tough subject, especially when it ain't yours. All I can do in response is to try and be informed as possible and continue saying what I think, which I've never been afraid to do, so I guess we out here. But as events continue to unfold, different ideas are shooting forth into the limelight. Some new, some old, but with newfound popularity, like a fun little acronym known as ACAB. ACAB stands for All Cops Are Bastards, which is the least pleasant acronym since SMD. It's a motto that apparently requires a lot of explaining because I took it at face value to mean all cops are bastards and tweeted about how if you think all cops are bastards, you're a dumb fucking idiot. But then a few people were quick to point out that all cops are bastards doesn't actually mean all cops are bastards, and also it does mean all cops are bastards, but in a different way than you assume that it means all cops are bastards. In which case, your acronym has failed. If most people default to your expression meaning one thing, but then you have to be like, no, that's not it, and then when you explain it, we have more questions than answers, you need a new slogan. How it was partially explained to me on Twitter was that no, not all cops are bastards per se, in which case don't say that then, but all cops are part of a bastardized system in which their continued perpetration of said system makes them into bastards, but not the definition of bastard that everyone in America is immediately accustomed to, which is bastard, but the bastard in which a bastard warps something that was previously seen to be good and twists it into something unrecognizable. This ideology naturally leads to the proposed solution of getting rid of police altogether. What would replace the police, you might ask? Community activists. I mean, that just sounds like police, but okay. What are police if not community activists who go out into their community and make it a safer place for the people they don't kill? What I don't get is how a community activist is any different from a police officer. They're a citizen who wants to do good in the community and prevent crime. They're going to need training. They'll have to pass some tests, I assume. And then what comes out is a trained officer who upholds the law, which is totally different from a cop somehow. If the goal is to just basically rebuild the police from the ground up under a different name because you think that would be easier than institutionally reforming the existing system, I guess I would understand that. What I wouldn't understand is how you would avoid falling back into the same shit you're trying to abolish. You're still going to have a brotherhood of community officers. They will gain mutual respect for each other and elevate their positions in their own minds. They will have each other's backs even under questionable circumstances. The crime rates are going to be the same on an ethnic basis, and the actions of the activists are going to be viewed through the same lens you viewed the cops, and with your absolutely zero tolerance for even the tiniest percentages of failure, I don't see how anything's going to be good enough for you. So, you'll still let the incredibly small minority of bad apples color your view of the whole system. You'll overpunish the officers when they make their within the margins mistakes. The people who volunteer to be officers will realize it's jailbait. A bunch of them will quit because nobody wants to get 15 years for shooting a man who lunged for their gun but the optics were bad. And then in a decade, you'll be pining to tear the whole system down again and start from scratch again, as if you can eliminate the variable of human nature when you cannot. People are always like, let's rebuild the system, as if you're not gonna fuck it up even worse than the last one, which has stood for centuries. And it's not just that you might mess it up, it's that you almost certainly will, because there are so many unaccountable variables and conditions and unforeseen problems and hidden factors, and it took our current police system almost 300 years just to get as mildly acceptable as it is now, which is the best it's ever been. Murders used to be like an 8% solve rate back when we didn't have computers. Now it's 62%. They used to hang people on a gut feeling. You know how far we've come? I resent this issue for making me look up so many goddamn stats. So let's summarize. I think George Floyd's death shouldn't have happened. His body had some contributing factors, but it's mostly the officer's fault. I think the protests at their best are fine. You're all going to catch corona. God damn it, now I have to talk about that now soon. But the peaceful protests are okay. The looting is bad. Antifa's involvement in shit is bad. They're there to incite violence. It's their written game plan. Do not trust them ever. I think the police presence at its best is also fine and generally good. I think the ones that abuse their power are bad, so go ahead and videotape them and get them fired. Just don't start in the middle of some shit where we don't have any context to how things got instigated. I think the police as an institution is valuable and necessary. I do not think it should be torn down and replaced with something that will just turn into a lamer version of what we already have. Okay. It's 2:40 a.m. as I type this. I've been writing this nonstop in one sitting for 4 hours, and now I gotta get through this stupid coronavirus angle. Ladies and gentlemen, the coronavirus does not decide how transferable it is between people depending on whether or not you're protesting. When you are bunched up in crowds of thousands, moving through the streets shoulder to shoulder with each other, your mask, which many of you are not even wearing, I've seen videos, can't do a whole lot to protect you. I thought we needed to defend the elderly and flatten the curve by social distancing and staying indoors for the next 2 years while our economy tanks, but instead it is apparently okay to disregard all of that in order to protest, but only if you're protesting the right thing. Because back when people were gathering to protest the lockdown, all you guys that are protesting now were like, how can you protest at a time like this? There's 30 of you on a street corner. You're putting everyone in danger, you selfish, unemployed jackasses who only want a haircut and aren't trying to feed their families after their businesses shut down. And I'm not a lockdown protester, but as an outsider, having viewed these perspectives chronologically, I guess my thoughts are like, fuck you, sorta? Kinda sorta fuck you to the people who thought protesting was non-essential until it was their turn? A little bit of a fuck you to the people in one block groups of 900 right now who a month ago saw a smattering of 10 people with signs on a sidewalk and wished they'd get corona because of how stupid they thought they were? Corona was always political. Not that it wasn't universally dangerous, not that the virus itself was some kind of politically biased life form, but the conversation was always political. And now you can see that plain as day. Isn't that neat? I am so tired. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at Sunburned Albino, and I will see you guys next time.